Hi guys, so this week we're starting our unit on Greek skepticism, and I want to start off with a lecture giving you sort of the broad strokes outline of like the story of Greek skepticism as a whole. We're mostly going to be focusing on the writings of Sextus Empiricus, who comes sort of at the end of this story. But I think it's helpful to get a sense of the tradition that he's a part of. And like whether it's one tradition or more than one, how much all of these people are doing the same thing, all of that is kind of up for debate. But so I'm going to talk you through a little bit of what happens in two of your required readings for this week. On the one hand, the article by Michael Freda on Stoic Epistemology. And just to make sure that you've noticed this, the syllabus, as the syllabus says, you're only required to read the first two sections of that paper. You don't have to read the whole thing. Of course, it's good for you to read. How could you be hurt by knowing more about Stoic epistemology? But I know you've got limited time. So look, all I'm going to hold you responsible for is those first two sections. So I'll talk a bit about what goes on in that article and a little bit about what happens in the Sedley article you've got for this week, The Motivation of Greek Skepticism. As I said, I'm just going to be giving you sort of the broad strokes, big picture here. I'm not going to get into the details of what happens in those readings. You will find out about that by reading them. But actually, let me start with something else. Oh, and sorry, I should say I'm working here with a handout, or the online equivalent of a handout. This has been uploaded to Canvas in the files section, so you can work through this document that shows up in my video here. Okay, I want to start with something that is not the handout though. This is a chronological table, as it says, that shows up at the beginning of the book that you need to buy at No Alibis. I believe these are in now, the Outlines of Skepticism. This is a translation of a primary source. This is a philosophical work actually written by Sextus Empiricus himself. The translators and editors have given us this table at the beginning, which I think is very handy for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, it's nice just to have a map where you can sort of see laid out some of these names and dates, right? A lot of these Greek names might be sort of running together in your mind. I'll talk through a few of them. But also I think it's helpful just to see how broad a span of time we're looking at here. I think a lot of us have a natural sort of inclination to think, or like it's easy to think of ancient Greece as like one time, and all of these people happening sort of at once. Like maybe some of them are a bit later than others, but just how broad a space of time we're thinking about. It's worth getting to grips with that. So here's a way that I like to think of it. So let's start off by identifying, we've got Sextus here. Sextus Empiricus, the main guy we're reading, shows up. On this chart, they've given him dates sort of from somewhere between 100 and 200 of the Common Era CE. There's some question about exactly when Sextus's dates are, but something like 1st or 2nd century CE seems to be our best guess. Let's just assume, just for the sake of it, just to sort of measure out how broad a space of time we're looking at. So let's just say Sextus dies in 200. Let's just imagine that. Let's say he writes Outlines of Skepticism, the thing you're writing, in 200 and then dies, just so we can have like one date. Here's something I want you to think about. So imagine you're in Sextus's shoes. Imagine instead of 200, this was the year 2000. I realize many of you were born after that, but all the same, that's sort of like now-ish. So if Sextus is writing in 200, then people writing in 100, that's 100 years ago. People writing in 1 CE, that's 200 years ago. So think about it like this. If we've got the year 2000 here, then this is like the year 1900. This is like the year 1800, 1700, 1600, 1500, 1400. Why am I spacing out those things? Well, if this is like 1400, the year 400, that's around when Plato's writing. Socrates dies in, I believe it's 399 BCE, so about 400, let's say. Think about like your history of philosophy classes, all that sort of early modern stuff, which seems pretty far away. Like Descartes was writing in the 1630s, 1640s, if I've got my dates right, definitely 17th century. Where are the 1600s on this picture? A couple hundred years after Socrates by Sextus's lights. I wonder if you even... So, I don't know what philosophers you know of who were writing in 1400. If we think about, let's say, back another 100 years off the charts here, pre-Socratics, maybe writing in 500 BCE, that would be like 1300 in this kind, from, contemporary perspective. That's around when Thomas Aquinas was writing. So look, this space of time, although it's all ancient, if you like, it's all sort of Greco-Roman, the space of time between Socrates and Sextus is farther than the distance between us and Descartes. We're looking at quite a space of time. And it's also worth bearing in mind that this was, so the number of surviving philosophical works from this period is much smaller than the number of works that were written and widely published at the time. I mean, that's just kind of how like life works. We lose things. But we know that people were writing a lot more stuff than what we've got. There was a lot of philosophy happening in between Socrates and Sextus, which means there was a lot of time for ideas to develop. But okay, so just to highlight some of the names in here that I'm going to mention. So Socrates, who dies around 400 BCE, he was an inspiration both for, Plato was a direct student of his. We're going to talk a bit about the Academy, which was the school Plato founded, and sort of a succession, a tradition, a school of philosophers who were trying to be Platonists, trying to expound on the sort of things that Plato thought. Arcesilaus, Carneades, these are going to be names that we'll talk about as academic skeptics. What do we mean by academic? We mean they were in Plato's academy. They were heads of Plato's academy, in fact. Socrates was also taken to be an inspiration for the Stoics. So the Stoics took themselves, just as Plato did, to be carrying on the philosophy of Socrates. I mean, the Stoics would say, Plato got it wrong. Here's really what Socrates was on about. And we're developing that kind of thing. So Zeno and Chrysippus are early Stoics. We'll talk about them in a second. One of the standard ways of understanding what's going on for academic skeptics is something in opposition to the Stoics. So the academic skeptics seem to take on much of what the Stoics say about epistemology, and then say, but you've got a detail wrong. And because of this thing that you're wrong about, your philosophy properly understood, in fact, leads to skepticism, contrary to what the Stoics think. How much these particular academics actually thought the Stoics were right about the stuff they were agreeing with them about, and how much they were just adopting it for the sake of argument is hard to tell. Some other names just to pick out. So the other kind of skeptic that we talk about in ancient Greece, other than academic skeptics, are so-called Pyrrhonian skeptics, and Sextus considers himself a Pyrrhonian skeptic. Those people are named after Pyrrho, whose dates are around here. He was a soldier in Alexander the Great's army, which gives you a sense of his dates. Timon was a student of Pyrrho's. Pyrrho didn't write anything. Maybe you've heard this story before about an ancient Greek philosopher. Pyrrho didn't write anything, but his student wrote down stuff that he did and thought. Timon's our main source for what Pyrrho himself actually did. Pyrrhonian skeptics don't actually show up in Pyrrho's time. This name of Pyrrho is sort of adopted as sort of branding or propaganda, if you like, by this guy, Aenesidemus, who, here's sort of a standard story. He breaks with the academic skeptics because they aren't skeptical enough. And he says, I'm going to get right back to, the real skepticism of this guy, Pyrrho. And then we have these other people, Agrippa, Menodotus, and Sextus, who are skeptics in the same tradition as Aenesidemus. Okay. That's just a chronological table. Okay, let's come back to my handout here. So I've put some what I'm calling key terms and key people in at the head of this handout. I'm not going to go through those right now, but those are just there for you to refer back to if that's handy. Something I do want you to notice here is not just the sort of quick gloss I've given on each one, but also for whom it's an important term. So notice in particular that, for example, academic and Pyrrhonian skeptics both care about suspension of judgment, epoche, but it doesn't look like academic skeptics care that much about ataraxia, or what we often translate as tranquility, although that's very important for people like Sextus, a Pyrrhonian skeptic. So keep that stuff in mind. One other thing, this Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, this is not Zeno of Elea, the guy who has paradoxes named after him. Zeno's paradox is like, if you have a foot race between Achilles, who's very fast, and a tortoise, but the tortoise gets a head start, then Achilles will never be able to pass the tortoise. Therefore, motion is impossible. Ha ha ha. Or like if you throw an arrow at a tree, fire an arrow at a tree, it'll never get there because it has to go halfway and then halfway. That's a different guy. An earlier, different person, not a Stoic. Zeno, when we talk about Zeno in this class, is almost always Zeno of Citium, the Stoic guy. Okay, so let me just give you a little bit of canned history. Here's extremely fast. So, important event in the history of Greek philosophy: Socrates dies, is executed in 399 BCE. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, kind of. He was sort of his tutor. Maybe he just was his tutor. Alexander dies in 323 BCE, so remember the numbers are getting smaller as time goes forward. This is later on. When we talk about the Hellenistic period, as opposed to, say, classical Greece, usually historians of philosophy at least mean something like around the time after Alexander the Great, up until the Romans overtake Greece in the 1st century BCE. Why am I bringing this up? Partly because Sextus usually gets counted as a Hellenistic philosopher, even though his dates, our best guess, are after what we usually take to be the end of the Hellenistic period. So if the period before the Hellenistic period is the classical one, the period after we sometimes call late antiquity. Sextus, if you just go by his birth dates, his birth and death date, it looks like he should be a late antique author, but we usually count him as belonging to the Hellenistic period because of which philosophers he engages with or doesn't. And he seems to have in mind the philosophers in Plato's Academy, the Stoics, the Epicureans, and maybe to some extent the Aristotelians or the Peripatetics. That's who he's speaking to, responding to. That's who shows up in his writings. He doesn't seem to respond so much to the philosophy that was kind of current in the late antique period. So we usually count him as a Hellenistic philosopher. Okay. So let's put things this way. I want to start talking about the Freda article. Now, why are we talking about Stoic epistemology when this is a class about skepticism? Partly because the first, sort of chronologically first, skeptics for us to care about in the ancient Greek world are the academic skeptics who, first of all, just like the Stoics, take their philosophy to sort of stem from Socrates, right? The academics, they're from Plato's Academy. Plato is a student of Socrates, not only is he a student of Socrates, but like Socrates is the protagonist in a ton of Plato's writings. Yeah, to some extent, at least, it looks like Plato's thought, although it is definitely more than he's not just, he doesn't even take himself to be just preserving what Socrates thought, but he does seem to be growing out of, at least, the kinds of things that Socrates argued for. The Stoics think the same things of themselves. They think they are carrying on in sort of developing the lessons from Socrates. So, right, we care about these academics who care about Socrates. The Stoics also care about Socrates, so it makes sense to see what they're thinking. But also, the skeptical turn that the academy takes seems, at least a lot of the time, to define itself in opposition to the Stoic epistemology. So, okay, here's how Frege sets things up. Stoic epistemology as building out of Socrates. He says there's a twofold challenge from Socrates. On the one hand, Socrates thinks the good life requires knowledge, in particular knowledge of good and bad, right? What's Socrates famous for going around and bothering people who take themselves to know things, people who act like they know what virtue is, or they know what, I don't know, what a human being is, or what knowledge is, and he just needles them, and he says, well, give me a definition. And they give him a definition. He says, oh, well, how about this? And they say, yeah, all right, my definition has to be wrong. And he just keeps doing that until they get to aporia. They get to an impasse. A lot of Socratic dialogues end with everybody just saying, yeah, I don't know what to say. I'm stuck. And Socrates says, aha, it turns out you don't know after all. You presented yourself as knowing, but you don't. And isn't this terrible? You need to know what's good and what's bad if you're ever going to lead a good life, but you don't. So fix yourself. Okay. So on the one hand, the good life requires knowledge, but two, merely having correct beliefs isn't enough. Merely having beliefs isn't enough. You need knowledge. What does knowledge involve? Well, it needs to be, as Frege puts it, or as I'm slightly paraphrasing Frege, your beliefs need to be elenchus proof. What's elenchus mean? That is the sort of Socratic method, right? This means Socrates has of coming up to you and questioning all your stuff and trying to get you to answer his questions adequately. So the fact that your beliefs go away in the face of Socrates doing his Socrates shtick to you shows that your beliefs weren't knowledge. So here's a quote from Frege. Socratic refutation seemed to rest on the fact that somebody who holds a belief as a matter of mere opinion can be made to see that he has equal reason to espouse the contradictory belief. Okay. So knowledge seems to require that you be able to resist the Socratic method of getting you to see that you have equal reason to espouse the contradictory belief. That must be something we need. Okay, let's move on from there. That's something we get from Socrates. Here's a picture the Stoics have of how we form our beliefs. They say we receive certain, Frege's translation is impressions, phantasiae, to which we can give or withhold assent. So you have some, you receive an impression, maybe like a perceptual impression, for example. So like I'm having a certain experience of like, there's a bunch of shiny white stuff in front of me with like a black border around it. It's got sort of words on it. It maybe appears like there's a computer monitor in front of me right now and a camera sitting on top of it. As well as receiving that impression, I can either give or withhold assent. So I can say to myself, I think this, I assent to this impression. I think this is actually showing me what reality is like. And I thereby come to believe that there is a computer monitor and a camera in front of me. Assent to an impression constitutes belief. On the other hand, if like I'm dreaming, if I have a dream, I might get the same impressions, right? I might have the same sort of experience of seeming to see a computer monitor and a camera. But if I think to myself, this doesn't seem right, I think this is just a dream, that's me withholding assent from the dream impression. So there I have the impression, but no belief because I haven't assented to it. Okay. If you have belief, there are three ways that can go. Your belief might be mere opinion, and they'll call those doxa. There's that word. Better than that, but not knowledge yet, is cognition or catalepsis. This word cognition, this comes out of a translation by Cicero into Latin. We can thank Cicero for a lot of the terminology we get in English, because one of the important things Cicero did was say, contrary to what many upper class educated Romans thought, that you can actually do philosophy in Latin, not just in Greek. Latin, we all agree, is good for like engineering and conquering and, sending legions places, maybe poetry. But you might have thought you can only do philosophy in Greek. That's the thing the Greeks do. Cicero thought, no, we can do the stuff in Latin, and I'm going to show it by telling you in Latin about a lot of the stuff that the Greek philosophers are doing. So he's responsible for translating catalepsis as cognitio, and then that sounds so much like a word we have in English that it sometimes gets rendered as cognition in English. But this is not necessarily connected with the general English word cognition that you might see in like cognitive science, right? Okay, so catalepsis means something like grasping. So a cognitive opinion is infallible. What do I mean by that? So did I say cognitive opinion? I meant cognitive impression. Okay, so if you have a belief, if you assent to a cognitive impression, that's infallible in the sense that it's impossible to have a cognitive impression that is false. So think about the impression of a computer monitor I had in my dream. That was false. That was misleading. I appeared to have a computer monitor before me, but assuming I wasn't sleeping right here, I didn't have a computer monitor in front of me. It was just a dream, right? It seems like there's a monitor there, but there isn't. In fact, I'm in my bedroom. There's no monitor in front of me. But the Stoics will say some impressions are not fallible like that. It's not possible for them to be misleading or mistaken. They are cataleptic. They're grasping. So if you assent to one of these special kinds of impression, then we'll say that's a special kind of belief. It's cognitive. It's a cognition. It might not be knowledge. I'll say why in a second, but it is at least better than doxa. It's a cognition, a catalepsis. Knowledge, as well as infallibility, requires what we can call incorrigibility, something that can't be sort of corrected away. If you know that P, then you can't be misled into giving up your belief that P. So this is where that idea of being elenchus proof comes in. So imagine you have received an impression that cannot possibly be mistaken. You might still be misled by some evil version of Socrates coming along and saying, well, how do you know that that's a cognitive impression? How do you know that that's really true? And if they're clever enough, they might be able to talk you into giving up your belief. If you could give up your belief, it's not knowledge for the Stoics. If the impression could be false, it's not knowledge and it's not a cognition. Okay, that's the picture they've got. So the standard move that skeptics make, the academic skeptics make along the way here, is to say, okay, maybe we can buy everything in this paragraph. There are certain impressions we get. Believing constitutes assenting to an impression constitutes belief. But they'll say, here's where the skeptics go wrong. There are no cognitive impressions. There are no impressions that are infallible, that are incapable of misleading you. No matter what appearance you describe, I can describe a situation where you would have exactly the same appearance, but it would be misleading. It would be false. If that's true, then you can never have knowledge. If you furthermore think what sometimes the Stoics seem to think, that you should only assent to cognitive impressions, then we wind up saying you should never assent to any impressions, which means you should never believe anything. Okay. That's a very rough sketch of Stoic epistemology and how academic skepticism sets itself up in opposition to it. Okay. Let me finally talk about the kind of picture that we get in the Sedley paper, the motivation of Greek skepticism. So this is supposed to cover both academic and Pyrrhonian skepticism. So here's a thesis statement from early in the paper. He says, what above all characterizes Hellenistic skepticism, so this is both kinds of skepticism that we're talking about, academic and Pyrrhonian, they're both in the Hellenistic period. What above all characterizes Hellenistic skepticism is its radical conviction that to suspend assent and to resign oneself to ignorance is not a bleak expedient, but a highly desirable intellectual achievement. It's actually good to suspend judgment. This is one of the weird things about Greek skepticism. So here's kind of his story of skepticism in, I've made it 6 stages. Okay, so stage 1, we learn from Socrates that his elenchus, his method of talking to people, leads to aporia. And maybe we worry that this means knowledge is impossible. Okay, around the same time, after Socrates, but before most of the major players that we're talking about, this guy, Pyrrho, is running around Greece. We mostly know about him via his student Timon. Pyrrho lived without beliefs, according to the stories we're told, and also was a danger to himself. So he's come back from campaigning with Alexander the Great, and apparently is going around telling people, I've got this tranquility, this peace of mind that a lot of philosophers at the time care about. The Stoics also say, we're going to get you tranquility. If you follow our methods, you will have peace of mind. You'll be free from disturbance, mental disturbance, I guess. Pyrrho says, the way that I've come to that tranquility, that peace of mind, is by avoiding belief. I don't have any beliefs. But here's the striking thing about Pyrrho. Apparently, his friends needed to stop him from walking off cliffs, and they needed to push him out of the way when an oncoming cart was about to run into him. And you can probably imagine the reason why. I mean, if he has no beliefs, then he doesn't believe there's a cliff I'm about to walk off. He has the appearance that a cart is about to run into him, and he says, I'm not going to assent to it. Then he just sits there. Okay, this seems bad. Not according to Timon. I mean, his friends didn't just think, this guy's an idiot, we should leave him to be run over. They saved him. Just hold that thought for a while. He's going to not matter for a while until we get down to step 5. Okay, step 2, the Stoics say, you should withhold assent from everything non-cognitive. These people are not skeptics. They do think that there are cognitive impressions. There are infallible, trustworthy impressions, if you like. And the perfect sage, although we are not perfect sages, the perfect sage would be able to tell which are which and to hold those corresponding beliefs in an incorrigible, elenchus-proof way. Okay, one of the heads of Plato's Academy, Arcesilaus, said, you should withhold assent from everything. Contrary to what the Stoics think, there are no cognitive impressions. There are no infallible, trustworthy impressions. Epoche is a good thing, epoche being suspension of judgment. Along the way, people say things like, wait, we should withhold assent from everything? Do you believe that we should withhold assent from everything? How do you know? Why should we listen to you? It doesn't seem right. This is a tension, a difficulty that Sedley talks quite a bit about. It seems like there's what we might call a performative contradiction between saying, you can't be sure of anything, and here's what you should do about it. Why should we listen to you? You're not sure of anything. Maybe that's a way of putting it. Another worry that people have is, if you don't believe anything, aren't you going to be like Pyrrho? Aren't you not going to act at all? Aren't you going to just sit there and get run over by carts and stuff? And yet here you are, like, taking charge of a philosophical school and going around and writing things and saying things. Actually, I'm not sure Arcesilaus wrote anything. I'm not sure if we know that he didn't write anything or if it's just that nothing of his survives, but regardless, there are a bunch of people in this story who didn't write anything, and we know about them by reports of others. But anyway, Arcesilaus is at least not as much a danger to himself as Pyrrho is, so it looks like you're maybe assenting to some appearances and not others. So we might think, if we like the skeptical line of thought, if we think there are no cognitive impressions and so we should suspend judgment, you need some kind of way of deciding which appearances to act on at the very least. A later head of the academy, not Arcesilaus's immediate successor, but one of his successors, a couple of scholarchs down the line, is this guy, Carneades. Carneades is more slippery than Arcesilaus. He didn't write anything, but he talks. He doesn't talk explicitly about epoche all that much. He does talk about to pithenon, which means something like the persuasive impressions. Just to note another place where Cicero has given us some translations. Cicero translates the pithenon as probabile. So we wind up with people nowadays writing about Carneades talking about probable impressions. But it's important to notice that something has changed. Something in particular has changed about what the word probable means over the millennia. So even in Cicero's own Latin, probabile doesn't mean probable in the sense of likely or like probability theory like we have today, which they did not have then. It means something like approvable or approved of. So that's maybe something like persuasive impressions here. But yeah, just be careful. Even if you're reading somebody talking about Carneades and what in his case sometimes gets called probabilism, this isn't the same probabilism that we've seen in like the Erickson and Hayek paper on degrees of belief before. Okay, so watch out for that. What is the persuasive impression doing here? Well, this is a way maybe of saying, look, some of our impressions are more persuasive than others, and those are the ones I go along with. So like, maybe I have an impression of a cart running towards me. Maybe I also have like some other impressions. Maybe I have like an impression that it's generally wrong to lie. That one's not that persuasive, so like sometimes I lie, but the impression I have of a cart bearing down on me is really demanding my attention, and so I wind up acting on it. I don't think that the persuasive impressions are more likely to be true, but they're more persuasive, so those are the ones I act on. Just pick something. I mentioned Carneades is slippery. As Sedley will tell you, one of the consequences of this slipperiness is, even in his own time, there was debate about whether he actually believed this, whether he thought the persuasive impression was like a doctrine of his. Or sorry, not whether he thought it was a doctrine, but whether it was a doctrine, or whether it was, and you're going to see this phrase in our readings to mean something different than you might be familiar with, whether it was ad hominem. So you might be familiar with, here's a thing that like people on internet discussion boards like to yell at each other. Oh, that's just an ad hominem argument. You're attacking the person instead of their argument, right? When, one member of parliament says, here is the policy we should adopt, and another member of parliament says, why are you going to listen to that guy? He's a communist. That's an ad hominem argument in our modern sense. You're saying, here's what's wrong with that person and why you should not listen to anything they say, instead of addressing the reasons that they've brought up. And that's usually described as a fallacy. In our readings, you will see discussion of whether Carneades is arguing ad hominem, whether Sextus is arguing ad hominem, and what they mean is something a little different. So when we talk about, let's say, the academic skeptics, agreeing with the Stoics about how belief works, that it's like an assent to an impression, will sometimes ask, do they actually mean that, or are they arguing ad hominem? And here what we mean is they're arguing not that it's true that you should never have belief because of these premises involving assent to impressions, but rather that Stoics should believe, or Stoics should accept, that you should never have any beliefs because they accept these premises. So like when we say Carneades is arguing ad hominem, we mean something like he's adopting his opponent's premises and trying to show that his opponent should accept his conclusion, not necessarily that the conclusion is true. Okay, so ad hominem, in the sense we're talking about here, is pretty clearly not a fallacy. But it does tell us something about what kind of attitude Carneades had to the things he was arguing for. So some people at the time, Clytomachus, an academic, thought Carneades was not being dogmatic. He thought that he was just arguing ad hominem when he said, some impressions are more persuasive than others, and those are the ones you go with. Philo of Larissa, another person, thought he was giving you a doctrine, and the subsequent academy, at least for a time, takes Carneades' idea of persuasive appearances as a dogma, as a doctrine, as something that they adopt and do further philosophy with. Which brings us to stage 5. Aenesidemus, whose name you'll see on the 10 modes that Sextus talks about in Book 1, was a member of the Academy when Carneades' Pythanon was taken as a dogma, and he, at least the standard story is, he broke with the Academy to start what he called a Pyrrhonian sort of revival movement, saying, you academics are, the Academy is no longer genuinely skeptical. It's become just another school, just another, let's use this word, dogmatic school of philosophy, where that doesn't necessarily mean dogmatic in exactly the sense we use it today, but just like in the sense of not being skeptical. So you'll see Sextus talk often about the dogmatist, and he just means philosophers who have doctrines or beliefs, philosophers who are not skeptics. If a skeptic is somebody who withholds assent from everybody, and a dogmatist is somebody who's not a skeptic, then they're people who assent to some things. Okay. So Aenesidemus breaks with the Academy to start a Pyrrhonian revival movement and takes epoche, suspension of judgment, to be a means to, happiness is not quite the right word, but a means to freedom from disturbance or tranquility, ataraxia. The ataraxia, that word, let's bring it up. Ataraxia, the A at the beginning here, that's a prefix just like the A in atheist. It's a negating kind of thesis, prefix. This stem taraxia, or this part taraxia, comes from a word like tarake, meaning something like disturbance. So ataraxia is freedom from disturbance. It sometimes gets it very often gets translated as tranquility. It's maybe not a perfect translation. It's good enough though, better than happiness. But that's the word I use down here. So Aenesidemus says, not only, it's not just that you should suspend judgment because there are no cognitive impressions, but rather he wants to say something like, suspending judgment is good for you. Makes you happy. If not happy, it at least makes you not sad. Not doing it is bad for your mental health. Okay, and stage 6, I'm calling stage 6. Sextus, as a final stage, he's somewhat later than Aenesidemus. He is a later exponent of skepticism and a compiler of arguments. He uses this term skeptic, which means inquiring. We have talked about this several times in class already. Yeah, I'm not sure if Aenesidemus uses that. We don't have any surviving works of Aenesidemus. The most we have is this Byzantine patriarch, whose name is escaping me at the moment, in, I think, the 8th century, wrote down a big work called the Bibliotheca, where he just wrote like one-page summaries of all the books in his library. I don't know if that was a way of bragging or if he was taking notes or what, but he had Aenesidemus's book, so we know a bit of what happened there. As I understand it, Aenesidemus called his philosophy Pyrrhonian. He didn't call it skeptical. That was somewhat later innovation. I think today we are not sure to what extent Sextus was an original philosopher in his own right, as opposed to being somebody who, as I've written it here, compiled the arguments of earlier Pyrrhonian philosophers. It's not incredibly important for us. The important thing is that his writing has survived, and that it's late in the tradition. So we're seeing sort of the mature thought of the Pyrrhonians. Yeah, that's where I'm going to stop. So something to notice here is an essential part of Sedley's story about the development of Greek skepticism is there's constantly this tension between wanting to recommend suspension of judgment as a highly desirable intellectual achievement. I forget how I started the sentence. There's a tension between believing this thing and, oh, wait, believing that thing. You're not supposed to be believing things. You're supposed to be suspending judgment. How am I going to tell other people to suspend judgment when I can't tell them I'm telling them to stop? It's tough. And we can understand the emphasis on ataraxia in Aenesidemus and Sextus as a solution to that kind of problem. So as you'll see in Sextus, he'll say, look, I'm not promising you that you'll get ataraxia from suspension of judgment. I'm just telling you that, hey, look, we Pyrrhonians, who are we? Well, we're people who suspend judgment. That's a thing that we do. And you know what? So far, we found it's a good idea. Like, it's really nice. Give it a shot. It'll be good for you. All those other people are having trouble. Oh, and by the way, here's how to do it. So Sextus's writings, the thing that we're reading now in particular is to some extent like a toolkit, sort of a how-to. The modes are like some standard arguments that you can use. Like if you find yourself in danger of believing something, if you've got an impression and it seems like you're going to assent to it, go through one of the modes. And then hopefully, if you do it right, you won't feel like assenting to the thing anymore. Maybe you'll be a little more balanced out. And if you're like Sextus, maybe that'll lead you to ataraxia. That would be nice. Okay, I'm going to wrap up there. You should read these papers and see more detail in Sedley's picture. I have in the rest of the handout questions for discussion. You can read those. We can talk about them on Friday. I'll see you in class.